Okay, everybody, thank you for coming. Tonight's share is dedicated for a Refuah Shlema to Notah ben Zeisel and Baruch ben Frida, and for the liberation of Eretz Yisrael from its enemies, safe return home of the soldiers and hostages, lasting unity of the people of Yisrael, and for all of those whose health has been affected by the war, and also dedicated to the release of the young man in Iran, Arvin Netanel ben Sonia in Iran, an Aliyat Neshamot for Yitzchak Hirsh ben Eliezer, and as well an anonymous contribution for the nitzachon of all of our chayalim and the chatufim to return safe and totally healthy to their homes. Hashem's protection of all of Klal Yisrael for the Refuah Shlema b'mheira v'yameinu. And again, we very much appreciate the Hachzakas Torah. We come in this Parsha, a very interesting thing. People don't always realize how much of the history of the Dor HaMidbar is skipped over. Meaning to say, last week, 2 weeks ago, we had the Gzeira of the spies, where we are supposed to wander for the next 38 and a half years. And then we had the story of Korach, and then we're going to have the mitzvah of Parah Aduma. But right after that, we skip forward, we fast forward 38 and a half years, meaning in the middle of Parshat Chukat, we move from year 2 in the desert to year 40 in the desert. And we're basically told nothing at all of what happened during that period of time. And Chazal actually tell us that's really very tragic in that way. For those 38 and a half years, till Moshe Rabbeinu died, the Shekhinah did not speak to Moshe until the 40th year, when a communication was resumed. So for all of those years, the Jewish people did have the man. They did have the man. They did have the clouds of glory. They did have the well of Miriam until she died, which is in Parsha Chukat, and then Moshe hits the rock. That's also the story in the Parsha. But mamish, how much of the desert experience was devoid of a direct communication with HaKadosh Baruch Hu? So mitzad Moshe Rabbeinu itself, that was a very, very tragic point, that he didn't have that Devekus B'Shem of Nevuah. But the Parsha begins with the mitzvah of Parah Aduma, the red heifer. The red heifer is in the news these days. As you know, there are a few Parah Adumas that have been identified. You know, for many, many years, I always had the belief from the time I was a child that the color of the red heifer was like a fire truck red, which is no such thing in nature. It was kind of a miraculous thing. But the truth of the matter is, the actual color of Parah Aduma is a fairly common color for cattle. It's simply orange-brown. You know, cows come in orange-brown. That's one of their colors. But the rarity of Parah Aduma is the fact that it has to be 100%. You're allowed up to one black hair or hair of another color. Once you have 2 black hairs, it's no longer kosher to be the Parah Aduma. That is a fairly rare situation, but we have discovered a number of cows that meet this, mainly owned by fundamental Christians for an interesting reason. One wonders what exactly is the hashgacha there, but the Jewish organizations that are involved in building the Mikdash and all of these different programs kind of want to take custody of the Parah Adumas, because a Parah Aduma can become pasal very, very, very easily, not only by a discoloration of more than one hair, but if, for example, somebody put a burden on it, somebody put a yoke on it, if somebody put their coat on it, let's assume I'm milking a cow, and I throw my jacket over the cow, which, you know, commonly people do. They put something on the cow, it's going to be puzzle, or the heifer rather, it's going to be puzzle. Right, so you got to be very, very careful with the Parah Aduma in terms of not mating it, not having it have intercourse with anyone, not having a yoke, and the like. Now, the Parah Aduma is a very special, specific institution. It is the ashes of the Parah Aduma when mixed with spring water that are sprinkled on somebody that has been in contact with a dead body. And if, for example, I touch a dead body, or I move a dead body, or I'm even under the same roof as a dead body, I am tamei tumat met for 7 days, and I cannot get out of my tumat met unless 2 things happened. Number 1, I have to be sprinkled with the ashes and water on day 3 of my tuma and on day 7 of my tuma. After my second sprinkling, I go to a mikveh, and when nightfall comes, I become tohar, I become pure. It's important to know, unless I am sprinkled with the ashes of the Parah Aduma, I remain tamei forever and ever and ever and ever, no matter how many days passed, and no matter how many days, and no matter how many times I've gone to the mikveh. This is why we make the common statement that everybody today is a tamei met, and therefore we're not supposed to go on the Temple Mount. Because without the afer, without the ashes of the Parah Aduma, there is literally no way to purify ourselves. So when people find the Parah Aduma, that's very exciting, because that creates the vehicle for purification. And once we're purified, we could enter the Temple Mount, and we could actually engage in building the Beit HaMikdash, etc. But it's very, very complicated, because in a way, in order to make the Parah Aduma, to slaughter it, to burn it, you have to be tahor. So that's going to be the problem. In the olden days, what would happen would be the residual ashes of the last Parah Aduma would be used to purify the people who would then make the new Parah Aduma. But you have to have some pre-existing ashes to make that first new Parah Aduma. So one of the questions is that even if we were to find a Parah Aduma, who will be able to prepare the Parah Aduma in a state of purity, since there are no ashes of the Parah that will be available? And the short traditional answer is that Eliyahu Hanavi will bring some remaining ashes from the last Parah Aduma. He will be metaher, because he's a Kohen, Pinchas is Eliyahu. He will be metaher a number of people who will then be able to prepare a new Parah Aduma. So people are mistaken if they simply think, oh, as long as we have a Parah Aduma, we can prepare it and be metaher people. They have to be in a state of purity themselves. Right? This is the Parah Aduma. So this is why halachically we don't go in the Har HaBayit. Now again, I hasten to add, because otherwise I'm going to get mail on this, that I understand that most of the Temple Mount, most of Mount Moriah, is technically not the area of the temple. And as a result, halachically it is classified as the camp of the Levium and not the camp of the Shekhinah. And because it's the camp of the Levium, a Tamei Met is allowed to go there, although a Nida could not. So so don't write to me that, this and that and that. I'm well aware that a majority of the Temple Mount, halachically a Tamei Met could go. It's 100% true. And that's why some poskim do allow it, particularly in the Dati Leumi world. However, the reason why most Gedolim do not allow it is not because they actually say that every part of the Temple Mount is Machaneh Shekhinah, the camp of the Divine Presence, but simply because we are not conversant enough in the boundaries, and therefore it's like walking into a minefield. If we had a minefield, and I happen to know where the mines are, and I would tell you, well, as long as you stay 3.5 inches from that corner, you're going to be safe. I don't know, I would be a little scared to kind of take my chances. I mean, what if I sneeze? What if I trip, right? So it's more or less. So again, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that you're chayiv kares. No, if you enter the Temple Mount in a state of Tumah, that's only true for the part of the Temple Mount that is the camp of the Shekhinah, and most of the Temple Mount is not the camp of the Shekhinah, but nevertheless, it's proper to be strict. However, I will say that if a woman is a Nida, then definitionally she would not be allowed to enter any part of the Temple Mount. And the same thing would be true for a man that had a seminal emission. But those are curable conditions, because the woman could take herself out of Nida, and the man could be tahor by going to the mikveh and waiting until night. It's the only condition that's not curable is the tumah of met, because tumah of met is the only tumah that requires the sprinkling of the Parah Aduma. So the sprinkling of the Parah Aduma is indispensable for purification from tumat met. And remember that tumat met essentially can hit me in one of three ways: touching the dead body, moving the dead body, or carrying it, even if you don't touch the body. So even if I carry it in a bag or just push it, that's masa. Maga is touching. So MAGA is not only Make America Great, it's interesting that that's the Trump's motto, but MAGA is touching the dead body. Masa is carrying or moving the dead body. And the third is Ohel, when I'm in under the same roof, and that would include even being under a tree that also overhangs the mess. I will say that there's a machlokas in the Gemara whether this tumah is only conveyed by Jewish corpses or even by non-Jewish corpses. Tosfos learns that if it's maga or masa, touching or moving, there is svadai no distinction between Jews and not Jews. But the machlokas is there tumat ohel. That's how Tosfos understands the Gemara. That's how the halacha represents it. It is interesting that the Shulchan Aruch does paskin, we should be machmir, that there's tumat ohel even by non-Jewish corpses, but some opinions are lenient in that particular area. Now, normally, again, I'm not going to spend the whole hour on the halachas of tumah. I have some more philosophical points I want to make, but we need to understand some of the halachic background on this. Normally, there is no avera for a Yisrael or a Levi to become tameh. I'm allowed to become tameh. A Kohen cannot become tameh to a met. But Tumah has consequences. Even if I'm a Yisrael, I'm not allowed to go to the Beis HaMikdash, bring korbanos, eat korbanos. If I'm a Kohen, I cannot eat truma and the like. So that's why we have all sorts of shilas about Kohanes who are not allowed to become tameh. If they're in an airplane that flies over a cemetery, even a non-Jewish cemetery, you got problems. If there's a dead body in the airplane, there may be problems. Right? That's why with Kohanim there are all sorts of complications. As a Yisrael, I don't have to worry about it, but when we have a Beis HaMikdash, even the Yisrael is going to have to worry about those issues as well. Okay, so this is what Parah Aduma represents. It is the vehicle of purification for Tumat Met. Here's a little bit of arcane knowledge. If you know, on the what's called the Golden Gate of the Old City, which overlooks the Kidron Valley and Har HaZeisim. So you may notice, if you've been there, you may notice that there's a small Muslim cemetery that's built right up to the walls, right up to the Golden Gate. Very small cemetery. I'm not sure if it's in use at all today. It's an old cemetery. So the story goes, the Muslims know our midrashim sometimes a lot better than we do. They know all these midrashim. Muhammad himself was very attracted to midrashim. He wanted to become Jewish because he loved the stories that were told in the midrash. And the story goes that there's an old tradition that Mashiach shall enter Yerushalayim through the Golden Gate, through the gate, because Mashiach will come from the Mount of Olives and enter the city through a gate that's sealed, but that gate will be opened up. So the Arabs knew, or the Muslims knew, that Mashiach has to be preceded by Eliyahu Hanavi, and they also knew the tradition that Eliyahu Hanavi is a reincarnation of Pinchas, the Kohen, and they also know that a Kohen is not allowed to become tameh to non-Jewish corpses, or to corpses. Therefore, they put a cemetery right outside of the Golden Gate because they thought that would prevent Eliyahu Hanavi from entering Yerushalayim, and without Eliyahu Hanavi, Mashiach cannot come. So the truth of the matter is, there's a lot of things, Baruch Hashem, that is wrong with that knowledge, and please rest assured that this will not have any effect on Mashiach coming. Number one, according to some opinions, a Jew is allowed to go through a non-Jewish cemetery because the tumah of a cemetery is based on ohel, meaning I'm not touching the dead body and I'm not moving the dead body, but either my body is positioned over the grave or there's a tree, etc. So if you follow the view that non-Jewish corpses do not convey tumah by being under the same tent, there would be no tumah. And even if you follow the Machmer Dika view, it doesn't say Eliyahu Hanavi has to go through the same gate as Mashiach. Eliyahu Hanavi can use another gate, and then Mashiach, who's not a Kohen, could go through the Golden Gate. So, Baruch Hashem, it's not going to stop the coming of Mashiach.
You can do Techiyas Hameisim also.
And yeah, that's right. At least momentarily, just to get them out of the way. Yeah. So Hashem has ways, meaning there's no way we could, whatever HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to do, there is no way that it's going to be stopped, right? So rest assured of that. Now we know that Parah Aduma is considered to be the most mysterious of all mitzvos. That is why the Torah begins with the language, Zos Chukas HaTorah, a chok. A chok is a mitzvah for which at least we do not understand the reason. Zos Chukas HaTorah. And Rashi brings that the Umot HaOlam make fun of us because we're doing things that make no sense, that are just irrational and the like. But this is the sign of the true servant of God. Because when I do things that make sense to me, you never know, am I doing it because it's God's will? Or am I doing it because I like it? It makes sense to me. So the real test of an Eved Hashem is the chukim and not the mishpatim. Reb Chaim Shmulevitz says, that's why it says, this is the chok of the Torah. It doesn't say, this is the chok of the para. Because the paradigm of chok is not simply illustrating a particular mitzvah, but it shows what my whole attitude is. Am I one who serves God? Or am I simply serving myself, and when the mitzvah corresponds to my logic, that's when I do it. And Reb Chaim Shmulevitz points out that the greatness of chok in the service of God is that it is unconditional submission that goes beyond logic. And he says, a human being never wants to be compelled to do anything. There's a natural akshanut, a natural stubbornness within the human being's personality that rebels against being told what to do. The husband that is about to take out the garbage to do his wife a favor, and as he's walking out, I'm not being autographical there, as he's walking out, there is a voice from the other room that says, please take out the garbage. There will, in that husband's heart, be a momentary feeling, I don't like to be told what to do. He was going to do it anyway. Psychologically, there's a very interesting Tosfos in Maseches Avodah Zarah. We have a caveat. The Gemara says in Maseches Bava Kama that Rav Yosef was blind, and he originally took the position that he was exempt from mitzvos, positive mitzvos. That was a halachic position. When he learned that the halacha is a blind person is obligated in mitzvos, he made a party to celebrate his obligation. And by the way, the Rishonim say that is the origin of making a special meal in honor of a bar mitzvah. Because you see that when you become obligated in mitzvot, it is not treated as a burden, it's treated as a simcha. So Rav Yosef's story is the source for Sudas bar mitzvah. Rav Ovadia Yosef writes, quite logically, that a Suda for a bas mitzvah is also a mitzvah. Why many Ashkenazim don't paskin that way is a difficult question, but nevertheless it's considered a simcha. Now the Gemara explains, why is it a simcha? Because when you do mitzvos that you're not commanded to do, you will still get reward. You will get reward. because you're voluntarily doing good things. So if a woman sits in a sukkah, which she is not obligated to do, she gets reward. But she gets reward as someone who is not commanded. And a person who does a mitzvah that they are commanded to do is a higher level of mitzvah than a person who does a mitzvah they're not commanded to do. Gadol hamitzuvah v'osa mimi she'eino mitzuvah v'osa. So the question is obvious. Shouldn't the opposite be the case? Meaning, if all I do is what I have to do, all right, what do I want? I want a medal? Like, I remember in yeshiva, sometimes people who never went to davening, they show up to minyan one day, and they present themselves in front of their Rebbe, like with a sense of pride. Rebbe, I was in minyan today. The Rebbe says, well, maybe the Rebbe should be nicer, I understand, but the Rebbe will sometimes say, what do you want? You want a medal? All you're doing is what you're supposed to do. But somebody who does more than they have to do, that should be more credit. Time and a half for overtime. Right? You do extra time, extra mitzvahs. So why is it the case? Gadol ha-mitzuvah v'yaisa mimi she'eino mitzuvah v'yaisa. So Tosfos says a fascinating thought. Tosfos says, as soon as you have to do something, there's a Yetzer Hara in you that says, I don't want to do it. And therefore it's harder to do a mitzvah that you're commanded to. Because when I do a mitzvah that I'm not commanded to do, I have this ego satisfaction. I'm so great, I'm better than people. I go beyond the halacha. When I do what I have to do, that's submission. That's not an ego thing, because you're just doing what you have to do. And Rav Chaim Shmulevitz says, Tosfos says, that's a bigger Yetzer Hara. And that goes back to the chok. The chok is about doing things out of submission to God. They don't make sense to you. They're not logical to you. You do them anyway, only because HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to do them. Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz gives a very striking example of how resistant we are to anybody giving us orders. If you remember, there was a man in the book of Shmuel, his name was Shimi ben Gera, who was related to Shaul, and he was actually the ancestor of Mordechai. And Shimi ben Gera, when David HaMelech is running away from his own son Avshalom, who wants to kill him, Shimi ben Gera is throwing rocks at David and saying, God is punishing you because you deposed or you were against Shaul, who is a better man. And Yoav ben Tzruya, who was both David's general and David's nephew, wanted to kill the guy. Yoav was pretty, not trigger happy, he didn't have a gun, but pretty sword happy. Yoav was always ready to kill those who stand up against the king. In fact, Yoav wound up killing Avshalom, David's own son. And David HaMelech uttered some very famous words. He said, leave him alone. If Hashem did not want me to be cursed and humiliated, He wouldn't have done it. Therefore, I accept this as my punishment from Hashem. But it's interesting that on David's deathbed, a short time later, he actually gives instructions to Shlomo HaMelech to find an excuse to kill Shimi. Now, this is not our topic, but there seems to be a direct contradiction. Where is this great patience? David HaMelech exemplifies this notion, I accept the pain and humiliation that Shimi is inflicting on me because it must come from Hashem. On his deathbed, he essentially orders Shlomo HaMelech, figure out a way to kill him, which Shlomo actually will. We'll get to that in a minute. But how do you understand the contradiction? So it's not really our topic, but I'll just suggest, here's the concept. Shimi B'etzem was chayav misa because he is showing disrespect to the king. He is rebelling against the king. The halacha is he's chayav misa. He deserves to die. But David was afraid that if he were to kill him then, he would be acting out of personal animosity and anger and the heat of the moment. So David determined to himself, I am not going to kill him now. I will accept this as God's punishment, and then I will be in an objective place where I could determine if halachically he should be executed. In other words, David did not want to act until he had reconciled himself on a personal level to the affront, and then he was able to deal with it in an objective way. It's very, very interesting. In fact, some apply this to parental discipline. A parent should not discipline a child when they are angry. The parent should discipline a child when they are calm. Because when you're acting, easier said than done. I'm not putting myself on a pedestal. I've made my mistakes too. But when you're acting out of anger, you're using your child as a punching bag. There is no heter to do that. The Bosner Rebbe, actually it's the father of the present Bosner Rebbe, Rabbi Yitzchak Breitowitz, zichrono livracha, that I was zochet to know very well in Boston. He used to tell us that his father, who was actually the first Bosner Rebbe, his father, used to hit him. In those days, parents hit children. But his father always waited 24 hours after the offense. His father never hit him within 24 hours because the father wanted to be sure that this was an objective assessment of what his child needed, and it was not lashing out in anger. So, be it as it may, that's why David HaMelech waited. But what did Shlomo do? What Shlomo HaMelech did was, he told Shimi ben Gera, you are under city arrest. You may not leave Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim, you will be chayav misa. Your punishment is you are confined, not to your house, you're confined to the city. So it mentions that Shimi ben Gera had some donkeys that had wandered off. Shimi ben Gera went to look for the donkeys. Shlomo HaMelech, of course, had his men watching Shimi, and when they saw that he left, Shimi was executed. So the question is pretty obvious. If somebody tells you, if you leave the city, you're going to be killed, who would be foolish enough to do that? This wasn't like, he went to his mother's funeral like some real reason that would make a person go no matter what. It was donkeys. You can get other people to look for your donkeys. He had servants. He was a wealthy man. So Rav Chaim Shmulevitz says that had he not been told he couldn't leave Yerushalayim, he wouldn't have left. He would have gotten someone else to do it. As soon as he's told you can never leave the city, there's this unbelievable need. I got to get out of here. It's claustrophobic. Even if somebody would say, you can never leave the country again the rest of your life. Somehow that's all right. I wasn't planning on leaving the country. But somehow I'm going to feel, I got to get out of here. It's too claustrophobic. I can't breathe. Because once we're told to do something, there's an inner rebelliousness within us. Okay, so that's what Rav Chaim Shmulevitz says is the greatness of chok. Chok is unconditional obedience. But now, let's go back a little bit. What is so mysterious about the Parah Aduma? Now, of course, there's a lot of things that are mysterious, a red cow, etc. But the truth of the matter is, what makes it the most mysterious? To be honest, there are quite a few things that are mysterious. I can't wear woolen linen. I got to put on these square black boxes on my head. I got to put on strings on my garment. Once we start asking, so many mitzvahs that we don't really understand all the details. Parah Aduma is not going to be the only one. There's a whole bunch. So what is so unique about Parah Aduma that Shlomo HaMelech says, I understood all the mitzvahs. When I came to this one, it was beyond me. So all the Meforshim say, because Parah Aduma is not just enigmatic, it's paradoxical and contradictory, meaning the chok of Parah Aduma is not simply the unusual ritual, but the fact that there is a contradiction built into the Parah Aduma, and this is the famous contradiction, mitaher es hatmeim. Anyone that's a tamei met, who is sprinkled with the ashes of the Parah Aduma, becomes pure. So the afer of the parah is a vehicle of purification, and yet all the people who handle the afer, the ashes, become tamei. Now, people ask, just to clarify something, I don't want to get into too many of the details of the halacha, although they're very interesting. There's a whole tractate of Mishnah with the laws of Parah Aduma, a very complicated tractate. It's Maseches Parah, but Parah Aduma and all of these halachas. People ask, how is it ever possible for the entire Jewish people to ever reach a state of purity, won't there always be the last person holding the bag? So, I'm a Tamei Met. You sprinkle the ashes on me, so now you're Tamei. So somebody has to sprinkle the ashes on you, so they'll be Tamei, right? So the problem is, you do this thousands of times, do this millions of times. The last person who sprinkled will be Tamei. So actually, once again, I don't want any male here. I understand Rashi happens to say the one who sprinkles the ashes does not become Tamei. That's how Rashi learns. But people who handle the ashes do become Tamei, and therefore there seems to be somebody who will be handling the ashes up to the sprinkler. The actual sprinkler does not become Tamei, Rashi learns. So the mistake of the question of the infinite sequence of Tumah is the following. The only person who needs Parah Aduma is a person who came in contact with a dead body. If I became Tamei by handling the Parah Aduma, that's not a tumah that comes from a dead body. That's tumah that comes from handling the Parah Aduma. That tumah, all you need is only a 1-day tumah. It's not a 7-day tumah. And all you need is to go to the mikveh and wait until nightfall. So consequently, the paradox you don't have. The last guy, right when, whatever it is, millions of Jews have become purified, and we then sprinkle it on the last person. So whoever did the sprinkling, whoever was the last person handling the ashes, all he has to do is go to the mikveh and he's fine. See, people are making a mistake in the question because they think that people who become tamei through the ashes need the ashes. They don't need the ashes. They just need mikveh, right? So that's why you don't have an infinite problem. Okay. So the chok of Parah Aduma is, how can the same thing that is a vehicle of purity also be a vehicle of impurity? It is the paradox that Shlomo HaMelech said, Amarti, this is a pasuk in Koheles, Ecclesiastes, Amarti echkema, I said I wanted to be wise, V'hi rechoka mimeni, but the wisdom was beyond me. The paradox of the Parah Aduma. So what's interesting is this. What's interesting is that even though this paradox is said to be so inexplicable, that even Shlomo HaMelech didn't understand it, the Svarim try to give us a partial insight into the idea of the paradox. And let's go back a little bit, a few parshios ago. We read that there are 3 categories of impurity that need to be expelled from the Jewish camps. Now, the Jewish camps have 3 sections. The Mishkan and the courtyard of the Mishkan is called the camp of the Shekhinah, the camp of the divine presence. Surrounding the camp of the Shekhinah was the camp of the Leviim, 3 families, Gershon, Kehat, and Merari, and Moshe and Aaron. Surrounding them on all 4 sides are the 12 tribes, Machane Yisrael. So we have Machane Shekhinah in the middle, Machane Leviah surrounding. Actually, it's a square formation, not a circle, and Machane Yisrael. Now, there are 3 tumos that have to be expelled from the camps until they undergo purification. There is the Metzora, which is the leprosy. There is the Zav, a gonorrheal man, or a woman that has a gonorrhea, or a man actually that has a gonorrheal discharge. And the final one is Tamei Met, he who has become contaminated by contact with a dead body. So, 3 machanot, 3 camps, 3 tameim. What makes this a little complicated, though, is that each tumah is only expelled from a different one of those camps. The Metzora is expelled from all 3 camps. The Metzora is not only expelled from the Mishkan and from the Levite camp, the Metzora is even expelled from the Israelite camp. He has to be like Miriam, chutz lamachana, outside of all the camps. So a Mitzayra is expelled from all three camps. The Zav is not allowed to be in the camp of the Shekhinah or the Leviah, but the Zav is allowed to reside among Yisraelim. So if a Levi became a Zav, he would have to leave for 7 days. He doesn't need Parah Aduma, he needs mikvah and korban, but he would leave Machane Leviah for 7 days, and he would be in Machane Yisrael. So, a Mitzayra is expelled from 3 camps. A Zav is expelled from 2 camps. And then we come to Tamei Met, which on one level is the most Chamor Tumah, because it's the only one that needs Parah Aduma. And yet, in terms of expulsion from the camps, it's actually the easiest. A Tamei Met is allowed in the Israelite camp. And as I said before, a Tamei Met is even allowed in the Levi camp. The proof is that even a dead body is allowed to remain in the Levi camp, because that is where Yosef, right, Moshe Rabbeinu, was the custodian at various times of Yosef's bones, Yosef's body, and that was kept in the Levite camp. A Tamei Met, however, is excluded from Machane Shekhinah, the Mishkan, the courtyard. That's why, as I indicated, a Tamei Met today does not go to the Har HaBayit, because part of the Har HaBayit is Machane Shekhinah, even though part of it is not. Okay, so we have 3 types of tumot, and each one of them is expelled from a different Machane. Mitzayra from 3, Zav from 2, Tamei Met is expelled only from 1, Machane Shekhinah. How do we understand this, right? It's a little bit halachically complicated. So Rav Tzadok of Lublin says the following idea. All of us are familiar with the famous teaching in Pirkei Avos, Hal Shlosha Devarim Ha'olam Omed. The world stands, the world endures on 3 pillars. Al HaTorah, Al HaAvoda, V'al Gemilas Chasadim. The world exists because of Torah learning, because of divine service, whether it's sacrifice or prayer, and Gemilas Chasadim, the kindness that one person does to another person. These 3 pillars are, of course, the pillars of our Avos. Avraham Avinu represents the pillar of loving kindness. Yitzchak, who was a sacrifice, represents the pillar of divine service. Yaakov represents, who spent 14 years in the yeshiva of Shem and Aver without having a regular night's sleep, represents the Amud, the pillar of Torah. These are the 3 pillars that keep the world alive. Without those pillars, the world could not survive. But what's interesting is, that's in Perek Aleph of Pirkei Avos. But the same way Pirkei Avos mentions 3 things that keep the world alive, Pirkei Avos later mentions 3 negative factors that destroy a person. Kina, jealousy. Taiva, excessive lust for hedonistic pleasure. Kavod, seeking glory and ego gratification. Motziin es ha'adam min ha'olam. They take a person out of the world. And as the Rishonim explain, not only does it mean you lose your olam haba, which of course you will, but you're even going to have a miserable life in this world. You won't even enjoy this world. You're the jealousy of what other people have means you'll never enjoy what you have. Taiva, the lust is incessant. It never gets satisfied. And kavod is even worse. A person desires kavod, he'll never be satiated. Right? Never be satisfied. Kavod is something that can eat a person up. It's a very dangerous thing. You know, when Moshe Feinstein was a young child, he was 9 years old. He already was he knew 3 Masechtas, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra, by heart. 9 years old. His father was the Rav of a town in Russia. And when little Rav Moshe would walk by people, they would stand up to honor such a great, great Talmid Chacham, 9 years old. And Rav David Feinstein, Rav Moshe's father, Rav Moshe's son was named after Rav Moshe's father, Rav David Feinstein. But Rav David Feinstein Sr. was extremely angry at the Balabatim. He says, "You're ruining my son by making him arrogant, by appealing to his kavod. You're ruining him. Person has to be humble, as Rav Moshe, of course, was his whole life. Kavod is very dangerous." Now, again, this is not a class on parenting tonight. Obviously, children do need to be complimented. They do need to be built up. I'm not suggesting at all that, although some parents had this philosophy for this reason. There were some parents who had a shita that they would never compliment their children. They didn't want them to get swelled heads. By and large, I believe that's an incorrect parenting strategy, because kids need to be given the chizuk that they're doing a great job. When they do a good job, they need to be validated. But the notion of kavod can be very, very, very dangerous. The most precious neshamas can be ruined by kavod. Last week we actually talked about this in connection with Korach, that Korach had the greatness of Moshe, but it was the desire for kavod that destroyed him. So now it turns out that kina taiva v'kavod destroy kedusha. So here's what Rav Tzadok says. This is a beautiful word. It's a little complicated. Let's take the three tumos of Mitzorah, the Zav, the Tamei Met, and they are expelled from the camps. They are symbolic of kina, jealousy, taiva, kavod. And the way it works is, the Mitzorah is jealousy. So let's take it one at a time. So when the Torah says, get rid of the Mitzorah, it's really saying, banish the midah of jealousy from your society. Why is Mitzorah connected to jealousy? Because we know that sarat, which is a physical manifestation of white splotches on the skin, is really a spiritual sign from God that you have to do tshuva. And the primary sin for which Mitzorah comes is Lashon Hara, saying negative, derogatory speech about other people. Right? So Mitzorah is associated with Lashon Hara. The very word Mitzorah, Motzi Ra, he says bad things about people, true or false. Now, if we go a little deeper, why do we have such an urge to say Lashon Hara about other people? Well, one of the most powerful reasons is there's a sense of jealousy. When I see somebody that is more popular than me, or is better than me in various ways, and I'm uncomfortable, and I'm jealous, I have a Yetzer Hara to pull him down, to kind of show, he's not as great as everybody says. I'll tell you something about him. Which means, Saras comes from Lashon Hara, but Lashon Hara itself comes from jealousy. Therefore, when the Torah says, banish the Mitzorah, the Torah is actually saying, get rid of jealousy. Now, jealousy is totally evil. There is no redeeming quality in jealousy. So jealousy is banished not only from the Mikdash, the Mishkan, and not only from the Levites, it's even banished from regular Israelite living, meaning which represents regular people, meaning no part of society should allow this midah maguna, this awful midah, to exist. Now again, easier said than done. Of course we have it. Of course we suffer from it to a greater or lesser degree. But spiritually, there is no positive benefit to jealousy. Now, you may ask me, well, what about the famous saying, Kinas Sofrim, the jealousy of Torah scholars. Right? I see you learning this tractate or staying up late at night, so I'm jealous of you. It increases wisdom, competition. Well, the truth is there are two types of jealousy. If the jealousy is such, you're doing good and I want to emulate you, that could be a positive motivator. But if the jealousy is, I want you to fail, there's nothing good about that. That's the evil of Lashon Hara, jealousy, and that's why the Mitzorah is expelled from all three camps. because it has no legitimate place in Jewish society, although we have it. But there's nothing good about it. It's only totally bad. It gets expelled. It gets expelled totally, right? Mida maguna, right? This idea of begrudging, and the truth of the matter is, this is something that is fairly pervasive. They say, even in something like dieting, for an example. Let's imagine you have someone who goes on a diet. They have, overweight friends together, and one person sticks to a diet, and they're successful. Psychologists have identified that very, very often the friends who have not been successful will subtly discourage the success. They'll say, oh, you're looking so emaciated. What's wrong if you have, a little cake or pie once in a while? And it comes in the guise of friendship, but in point of fact, it's emanating from a certain jealousy. Because we're always uncomfortable if I'm down here and somebody's up there. Now, there are two ways of redressing the imbalance. I could lift myself up, or I could try to pull you down to my level. Gravity is an easier force to work with. It's easier, gravity, to pull you down than to lift myself up. So that's why the Mitzayra is expelled from all three camps. Now, Zav, which after all is a sexually transmitted disease, represents metaphorically taiva, an over-connection to sensual and hedonistic pleasure. Also a bad thing, get rid of it. But what's interesting is our connection to taiva, lust, pleasure, is a bit more equivocal and complex than our relationship to jealousy. When it comes to jealousy, I can at least say in theory, if not in practice, totally bad, totally treif, get rid of it. When it comes to taiva, that's not so clear, because it is God's will that I enjoy the world. Right? We make brachos, we express our joy. The first mitzvah of the Torah, be fruitful and multiply, enter into a marital relationship. Chazal say the person who tries to be ascetic and become a Nazir is a sinner. So if kina is totally bad, taiva has a place in life. It's a way, number one, it keeps me alive. That's why they say eating addictions are the hardest addictions to break, because it's the only one that you cannot go cold turkey on, right? So you have to eat, etc. So that makes it a harder type of addiction. It has a makom, both in terms of my physical survival, in terms of my mitzvos, and even as a vehicle of enhancing my appreciation and gratitude to God. So therefore, the zav is allowed, so to speak, in ordinary life. Machnei Yisrael, regular people. In a regular life, taiva has a place within moderation. The only thing is, as you graduate spiritually into the Levite existence of Torah and Kedusha, definitionally, you will distance yourself from taiva, not out of a self-conscious renunciation strategy, but simply because it is going to interest you less as you progress. The same way an adult kind of stops playing with children's toys. Adults have their own toys, to be sure. Now, it's not that an adult makes a decision, I will no longer play with these toy soldiers. It's kind of an automatic process of maturation. Then what happens to a person as they graduate, so to speak, or if they graduate from Yisrael to spiritual Levi, because Yisrael can be a spiritual Levi as well, automatically they become less connected to the taivas of the world, because they're involved in something so much higher, so much better, so much deeper. It's not that I renounce the taiva, it's just it no longer holds an allure for me. So therefore, that's how it works with the zav. The zav who represents taiva, the zav gains admission in ordinary society. But as you grow spiritually, you become more and more distant from it. So that's why the zav is expelled from Shekhinah and Leviah, because the connection to taiva is going to be attenuated as you graduate. Okay. We now come Right? So again, Mitzayra represents jealousy. Zav represents tava, lust. We now come to Tamei Met, which is the most connected to our Parsha, really. This is the first two were a little bit of a digression. Tamei Met represents kavod. So when we say banish the Tamei Met, we're actually saying banish the ego, banish the kavod. Why is that? What's the connection between Tamei Met and kavod? So remember that Adam Harishain and Chava were supposed to live forever. They were put into the Garden of Eden, they were put in Gan Eden to live forever. Immortality was the natural state of Adam and Chava. But because of the chait of the Eitz Hadas, they were only given one commandment. But because of the chait of the Eitz Hadas, death came into the world. What was the primary enticement that the Nachash used first against Chava, and that Chava communicated to Adam? So Rav Tzadok says that the primary enticement was kavod, because the Nachash said, the day that you eat from this fruit, v'hayisem kelekim, you will be godlike. Yodei tov v'ra, you will know good and evil. Now, what that exactly means, one can spend literally your whole life trying to understand this. This is one of the most deepest parshiot of the infinite Torah, that's without boundary. But the pasuk is basically saying that the fruit of the Eitz Hadas was marketed as a God pill. Eat this, and you will be God. Now, in many ways, we are godlike. We are created in the image of God, and that means we're given wisdom, we're given autonomy, we're given free will, we're given the ability to manipulate nature in all sorts of ways, and the arrogance to make ourselves God is what brought death into the world. And Rav Tzadok says, it's not so much that death is a punishment, but death is the ultimate reminder that as godly as we are, or can become, there's an unbridgeable gap between creator and created. And that is, we are mortal, and the creator is immortal. Death is the ultimate, right? What happened basically is, death came into the world because we looked for kavod. We were arrogant. We thought we were like God, or we should be like God. And therefore death came into the world to remind us that we are not God. We have to serve God. That is why the purification ritual of death that purifies you is ashes. Now, I'm not explaining a red cow, why red, etc. But we know that ashes is always a sign of humility. When Avram Avinu declares to Hashem, I am nothing, and I need your mercy for Sodom, Avram's words are, Anochi, Afar, Ve'efer. I am dust, I am ashes. So here is the thing. Death came into the world because of arrogance and kavod. How do we become liberated from the impurity of death? By connecting to the ashes that are humility and submission. Parah Aduma purifies me because it connects me to the notion of humility and submission. Death came into the world only because of the opposite force. I become liberated from death. I become liberated from the tumah of death by connecting to ashes. And that is why the vehicle of ashes is the vehicle of purity. But here is the problem with ashes. I'm going to make two statements that are totally contradictory to each other, and they're both true. Statement number one is arrogance, gaiva, hubris is the most destructive, sinful qualities that can exist. A human being must recognize that they are nothing without Hashem. Humility is the most important quality. That's statement number one. Statement number two, without a sense of my value and my importance, without recognizing my greatness, I'm not able to serve God. Right? This is essentially the paradox of the famous Maimer of Rav Bunim of Pershischa, was a great Hasidic Rebbe of the 19th century, that a person has to have in his two pockets at all times two contradictory ideas. In one pocket, Anochi afar v'efer, I am dust and ashes, I am a zero. In the other pocket, Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam, God created the whole world for my sake. He created many cows and many horses and many dogs and many cats. He only created one man and one woman. And the Mishnah says in Sanhedrin, so that every single person should say, this whole world is here only for me, which creates a responsibility. So, if I only had the Bishvili Nivra Olam that some people have, I'm just pure arrogance. If I only have Anochi Afar V'Efer, I'm depressed, I'm broken, I feel worthless. I gotta live with both of those ideals. I have to recognize how inferior I am. And again, this actually overlaps with last week, Cain and Abel. And I have to recognize my greatness and my potential. This is why, if the symbolism of Parah Aduma is you become liberated from death by connection to ashes, there are what you might call good ashes, and there are what you might call toxic ashes. The good ashes is when I realize that without Hashem I'm nothing. And therefore, I'm grateful that whatever talents and abilities I have only come from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I become empowered and I become energized to serve Hashem in a good way. But the problem is, the attitude of ashes could also have a very, very detrimental side, giving me a sense of worthlessness, a lack of self-esteem, a Yetzer Hara, that why would God care about my mitzvos if I'm so insignificant? If you think about it, humility, when taken to the extreme, could actually result in a person not keeping the Torah. A person's going to say, why would my learning make a difference? Why would my davening make a difference? Why would my mitzvahs make a difference? Who do I think I am? That's a from Yetzer Hara, the Yetzer Hara of humility. So, this might be a partial perspective on why the ashes of the parah purify and the ashes of the parah contaminate. Because the midah of humility can be the greatest tool in Avodat Hashem. It purifies you. And it can also be the most destructive force that takes you away to Hashem, from Hashem. Matahir, right? It purifies the impure, but it also creates tumah. And to go back to the camps, here is the idea. If the tumah of met comes from kavod, a sense of kavod, of dignity, of importance, of significance, I matter, it's not only something you need in the Israelite camp, which is everyday life, but even the Levi needs it, even in ruchnius, even in spirituality, even in mitzvos, I need that quality. Because otherwise I feel my avodah is insignificant. The only thing is, when you reach the highest level, which most of us may never reach, of total unification with God, then you can get rid of your ego totally, because you're connected to Hashem. And just like the light of a candle totally gets annihilated within the sun, so too you don't need your ego anymore. But to get to there, I need a sense of my chashivas. I think I had mentioned the beautiful statement of Rabbi Yerucham. If a person is not aware of their faults, they are a foolish person. Because how could a person think they're perfect? I think I don't have any flaws? What type of idiot am I? That's my biggest flaw. My biggest flaw is not to have the self-awareness that I have flaws. But a person who does not know their greatness is not just a foolish person, they are a tragic person. Because they will never become the person they were intended to be. Hashem had a plan. Every one of us has a reason to be here. If I don't recognize the kochot that Hashem gave us, and this of course is vital for parents and teachers to impart to children, then I'll never be what I'm supposed to be, and that's a tragedy. I go through life never realizing what it was that I could have been, that I should have been, that I really was, and didn't even know. At the Chazon Ish's Levaya, the Chazon Ish was nifter in 1953, I believe. Obviously he was buried in Bnei Brak. So Rabbi Eliezer Dessler, the famous Michtav Eliezer, who was the mashgiach in the Panovich Yeshiva at the time, saw a student of the yeshiva sobbing, crying, as the Chazon Ish was being buried in the ground. And Rav Dessler went over to the boy and said, "Why are you crying over the Rav, the Gaon, the Tzaddik, who's buried in the ground?" He then pointed to the boy. "Why don't you cry over the Rav, the Gaon, and the Tzaddik that's buried in you?" Because the Rav, the Gaon, and the Tzaddik that's buried in the ground became the Rav, the Gaon, and the Tzaddik he was supposed to become. But how many of us go through our lives never becoming that? Now again, I don't mean to suggest at all that everybody is expected to be the Rav, the Gaon, and the Tzaddik. But we do have something special to give to the world. We do have something special. And by the way, when I say the world, I don't mean a grandiose statement either. Sometimes it's the way we raise our families. It's the way we relate to our spouse. It's the way we're machanech our children. Again, these things could be relatively small scale. But there's all sorts of possibilities about the life that we can create. And that life requires kavod. Kavod, not in the sense of arrogance, but in the sense that I matter, that I'm significant. So, just to close the circle, this is a partial explanation of the paradox of Parah Aduma. Death came into the world because of arrogance and a desire for kavod. We become liberated from death by our connection to the humility of ashes. Fine. However, that humility itself can be dangerous and counterproductive when it moves in the wrong direction, when it turns into self-loathing, when it turns into a lack of self-esteem, when it turns into not recognizing our value or our worth. And that is merumaz in the idea that the same vehicle that purifies you from death can itself be a vehicle of impurity. So it's interesting that we at least have a limited perspective on the paradox of the Parah Aduma. It brings purity into the world. It also creates impurity. Let me just end with a very, very quick vort from a great Hasidic Rebbe, the Apter Rav. And he was known as the Ohev Yisrael, the one who loved Klal Yisrael, because number one, he was an Ohev Yisrael, and number two, his sefer was called Ohev Yisrael. And he brings an interesting medrash that basically says, if you want to understand Parah Aduma, you have to understand Avas Yisrael. Avas Yisrael is the key to Parah Aduma. This is a very enigmatic statement. Parah Aduma doesn't seem to have a lot to do with Avat Yisrael. So the Apter Rav explains it in a very beautiful way. He says, in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, for a Kohen to become Tameh, even if it's only for one day, was a major inconvenience. He wouldn't be allowed to do service in the temple. He couldn't eat korbanos. He couldn't eat truma. Meaning when a Kohen became Tameh in those days, he was put out. Now, what it's saying is, therefore, when a Kohen prepares the ashes and the water to purify another Jew, the Kohen is willing to give up his conveniences to help somebody else. So says the Apter Rav, instead of looking at Parah Aduma as a paradox, it's actually a cause and effect. The reason why it purifies and brings purity into the world is because somebody is willing to become Tameh to help another Jew. Meaning, it's Metayar es Hatmeim, it brings purity into the world because it brings Tumah to somebody else who is willing to inconvenience themselves for another Yid. And he says, that is what the Medrash means, that the paradox of Parah Aduma illustrates Avat Yisrael. We're in the month of Tammuz, and we are approaching, of course, the 3 weeks. Today, of course, was the Lubavitcher Rebbe's yard, so also something to think about. Such a great Ohev Yisrael, great in so many ways, and looking prospectively, we're approaching the 17th of Tammuz, the period of Avelut over the Beis HaMikdash. And this is a time especially when we need to think about Avat Yisrael, Sinat Chinam. I've said probably every week since October 7 that in the aftermath of October 7 there was a great unity in Klal Yisrael. It was a bracha amidst the dark clouds. This was a silver lining in the clouds. Unfortunately, in many, many ways, life goes back to normal, even in the middle of a war. And a lot of this achdut is disintegrating. But we need to think about how in our own lives we can bring it back. And when we bring it back, we're bringing Klal Yisrael closer and closer and closer to the Geula Acharona that all of us crave. So thank you very much.